Hello, and welcome to SG Squared. Steve Gladen, the global pastor of small groups from Saddleback Church, pulls from his over 25 years of experience to encourage and equip listeners like you to lead small group ministry. So let's listen and learn together.
Welcome to SG Squared. Steve Gladen on small groups. Derek here with the man, the myth, the legend, Steve Gladen. Steve, how are you doing, my friend?
Hey, going really well. It's spring is officially in super swing here, even though, there's always parts of the US that are doing other goofy stuff. And I tell you, it's crazy. Life is crazy, life is busy, life is full. But what else do you do? What else do you do in life? But you just keep moving on.
Hey, spring has sprung, and it was so great to see you a couple weeks ago down in SoCal and have some coffee with you. But I was overwhelmed, because up here where I live in the Northwest, a couple weeks ago, it was midwinter break for the kids in school. So we all try to get down to Cali to get some sun, right? And it was like mid 70s and gentle breeze. And then I come back. I go from that, right? Beach lights, mid
Yeah.
70s gentle breeze to colossal hailstorm, like raining down as you're trying to run inside. So what a tale of two worlds. But yeah, spring is sprung, and I cannot believe it's already this far along in the year.
Try to tell you not to move away. Try to tell you not to move away. But, all I can do is try to coach, and it's up to you to listen.
Well, give our listeners a little preview of what we're getting into in this exciting episode.
Yeah, I mean, as you guys saw from the title, three mistakes to avoid with your lead pastor. And I think as I've been chatting with other small group pastors around the U.S., especially, these three things have kind of kicked up pretty strong. And it's also true because I saw them with Rick, and I see them with Andy too. And Andy's a lot newer, so I have less relationship with him. But you still see him, and there's still three things I think are super important because as we're doing small group ministry, we're always working with a lead or a senior pastor. And so that's just the nature of the beast. So it's important that we kind of go in with our head screwed on, super, super, screwed on. This is a tough analogy. I was going to say screwed on straight. But you just want to make sure that you're in lockstep with your who's ever leading the temple courts as you're leading the house to house.
Yeah, I think this is a very important, critical topic because we all want to do the best we can in our small group ministries or whatever ministries we're leading. But like you said, we got to be syncing with the lead or supervising pastor because God wants us to be unified, but we can really only go as high as we are healthy with them. So let's jump into this. I'll read off mistake number one, and then Steve, you kind of jump in, and I'll give some thoughts as we go.
Yeah, and I love where you went with that too, because so much of this is about relationship. And if the enemy can fracture temple courts and house to house, what a win for the enemy to make the church ineffective. And I think these are some things that will help with that. So, the first one is we're going to talk about is wrong assumptions. And I think the number one thing that I would say, and we're going to throw an article in the show notes so you can kind of see an article I wrote off that. That's kind of what spawned all this. But when we assume the motives of someone else, most times you're wrong. And I can't tell you so often, because of a lack of communications, so often what can happen is you think something about the senior pastor or the lead pastor, and it isn't true. It never was. And we can spiritualize it and say it's the enemy that planted the thought, or maybe it's our insecurity that planted the thought, or maybe there's a number of things that can plant the thought. The bottom line, it's not godly. And I think the number one thing you just can't do is assume wrong assumptions with that. So it's really important because the danger of assigning motives when we don't have all the facts is when it gets real dangerous, which requires us to beef up the communication. Derek, I don't know if you ever had this before, but a lot of times if you assume something, and I know I've been married, 35 years, and I know you've been married 20-ish, in that zone. I don't want to put you on the spot to remember how many years you've been married, but go ahead, I'm putting you on the
It'll be
spot.
25 this September.
Wow, 25. So there's a lot of times in relationships is that, sometimes you can think you know what they're talking about, and it leads you to, the wrong assumptions with where you're going.
Well said. And yeah, having spent years in ministry, not as many as you, but I've been guilty of this myself, assuming that I know, what my lead pastor's thinking. But like your notes say, I'm not able to be in his shoes, and I don't know the weight he carries. And, he's seeing stuff I'm not seeing, right?
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is it forces us to um a lot of times we go to assumptions because we're getting lazy on the communication skill side of it. And so, what I would really, with all three of these points, you're going to see a common thread of relationship and communication that has to be fine tuned. And one of the things that we assume sometimes because we don't want to dig down and find out, hey, what did you mean by that statement? Or I saw you do this. Did this mean that you didn't like what I did, or you did like what I did? But I think the main part of it is that you've got to go that extra mile, sharpen up the relationship a little bit, and on our side, you got to go with the sharpening our communication. And I think that plays into the next point too that we're going to talk a little bit more on, is that you gotta work at this relationship piece.
Yeah, I would concur that the communication piece is so critical, because it's crazy how the mind plays tricks on you, right? And then we forget that we've got an enemy that's coming to kill, steal, destroy, divide. Of course, he wants to divide not just relationships, but church staff because the stakes are so high. And so, if he can get us not communicating and being lazy and assuming, man, it's scary what can happen. But that's why we've got to over communicate and just have those conversations. Hey, can I get some clarity on this or whatever it is?
Yeah. And so in the raw assumptions, here's the main conclusion at it. It says, choose to believe the best. And I think that's one of the things we have to always remember with our lead pastor. Choose to believe the very best in them. Ask God to give you his love and grace and to help you give you grace, expecting nothing in return. And then I concluded up here with this: you will never know the full impact of the lead pastor's world. And that is so true. I mean, I was more close to Rick than I am to Andy right now, but I'll tell you, you just don't know the brevity of what they go through and what they're feeling and all that. And then I conclude with this: help them see you as a friend, not as a foe, and with the wrong assumptions.
Well said. All right, let's jump to mistake number 2, impatience.
Yeah. And this is a big one because I am so guilty of this. Part of, where I'm always at is I always want things to move on my clock at my time and doing it my way. And part of impatience, what I find is when it doesn't go my way, a lot of times my trust in God having the situation, I kind of feel like, hey, I got to grab that wheel from God. I've got to help him drive the car. I've got to help do these things. And many times when things aren't clicking the way I want, again, these all tie together so well because what happens is when I get impatient, I'm not trusting God. And then when I'm not trusting God, I get more paranoid about, okay, why isn't this happening? Why are things not in sync with the way they should be? And so many times what happens is that God is working things in the background that I can't see. And I think through so many things, and I like I said, I have more data points with Rick, but there's so many things in the small group ministry I wanted to see happen, but God was working in the background. And so often when you're looking back, it's so much easier to see God's hand than when you're in the moment or when you're looking forward. And so what I've said is, and we say time and time again, is when you're in that place of impatience, is you've got to pray a little bit more. And you got to balance that out with, and this is where it sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but when you're impatient, a lot of times we're saying, hey, pray a little bit more, trust God, He's working for you in the background. But also at the same time, what can help with your lead pastor is not being what we call the bad general. There's the tale of the good general and the bad general. The bad general just takes orders and executes them. And a lot of times when we're trying to build a small group ministry, we want to please, we want to do exactly what the lead pastor's wanting to do. But in essence, what a good general does is that they'll still end up executing whatever the command and control wants. But what they'll do is they'll always update them and let them know of what's going on. And they'll say, hey, more troops have come onto the hill. Our casualty count's going to be higher and things, and they'll give more data points. And then the lead pastor in this analogy can go, okay, we'll still do that or we won't do it. And so what can happen sometimes is that when we just acquiesce and do whatever they say versus be able to give good input, what happens is it deteriorates the relationship, and there's no iron sharpening iron, as the Bible talks about. And if you've ever seen iron sharpen iron, there's sparks sometimes. And so it is a delicate dance of, trying to be a good general and share the things that need to be done and why they need to be done and those things, but also being content if your way doesn't get picked. And part of that will help us lead to being able to say, okay, I'll lean a little bit more into prayer because I know if I'm ever in a spot where we have a difference of opinion, I know that God can change his mind much quicker than I can through prayer and the Lord and the Holy Spirit moving on him. So there's a place in this whole scheme that says when impatience creeps in, there is a factor of trust that needs to happen. There's also a factor of me showing up the right way, but also being able to say, if I don't get my way, then I'll lead the best way I can with the way the lead pastor wants to go.
Well said. Impatience. Mistake number 2. So I guess the opposite of that would be exercise patience. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit, right?
Yeah. Let me read the conclusion with it. That's in the article. You guys can read this too down below, but it says, we're only responsible to suggest and pray. God is more than able. God is more than able to work. He is, wow, sorry, I just messed up my screen right here. I don't know if that's in.
You want me to read it?
That's an edit piece. Let's first off edit that out. I'll finish. Gosh, why is it doing that? My screen is just freaking out every time I try to move this thing. It's trying to move it out of the thing. So I'm gonna curse here on the screen. Okay, let me read it and then just pick it up there. Edit it out. Okay. Let me read the conclusion piece right there. It says, we are only responsible to suggest and pray. God is more than able to work. He will in their lives and without our help when we trust in God. Our job now is to be patient, which is exactly what Derek was saying. The opposite of impatience is patient. Our job is to be patient with the process and to trust him to do the work. Sometimes God is working in the background and doesn't tell us. And isn't it just like God, not to tell us every move that he's making? So the first one right there was being able to say, the first mistake was don't make wrong assumptions. The second one is understand and, work on impatience. And then Derek, number 3 is?
Number 3 is the best. We save the best for last. defensiveness.
Yeah. And defensiveness can come in through a couple different gates here. One is when we feel we are wronged, and then we can get super defensive. Another aspect of it is where we are wrong and we know we're wrong, but we'll still get defensive just because we're broken in our human nature. And then there's part when there's a mix of responsibility of who's wrong and who's right. And part of what happens in this case is that, part of what we got to do is, again, open up that communication to get clarifying statements done. You said this, is that what you meant? With anything that where communication has gone wrong, but also just trying to understand, from their side of the equation, and just being able to say, how could I have helped the situation out, or how could I have cleared the situation up better? And there's many times where there's those shoes where Rick, I felt, was more wrong than me. And so I got defensive, or I just kind of messed up and felt I was misunderstood, and I got defensive, or we were both miscommunicating and we were both, defensive to each other. And so it's important that you start to look at this whole point and to say, bottom line is we're here to serve the lead pastor. And what we want to do is be able to get to that point where whenever defensiveness creeps into our heart, we need to hit the pause button and be able to say, it's a good sign that, there's some communication that's broken. Now, if it's really, really spicy, there may be a time where you just got to take a time out to say, hey, I'm a little bit of out of sorts. Can we talk about this tomorrow? Or there may be a time where you can, jump into it right then. But the main thing is that use defensiveness as a way to say, like the lights on your car click on, if it says, hey, low oil, it means you got to address something. When defensiveness happens, that's a light coming on your relational dashboard with your lead pastor and saying, hey, something's clicking here. I've got to get to the root of it before it builds into something else. And the thing about all three of these, when you go to wrong assumptions or impatience, or when you go to defensiveness, is that if they're not addressed and you just make nice, what can happen is that they will fester and they'll create larger things. So defensiveness is a big piece of it.
Yeah, this was something I've definitely dealt with in my ministry experience at different stops. Relationships can be messy. Church, community can be a beautiful mess. And so much of it in staff struggles was, often due to, some other pastor's defensiveness or mine. And what you're saying here is so key, because God wants us to have that soft heart, right? So that we're not only working together in unity, but man, we've got a heart to pray for our pastor or those that we're working with. So it's definitely something we've got to be able to check our hearts, right? To make sure we're not getting that defensive hard heart.
Yeah, and it's important for each one of us. It's a calling and it's a privilege to work for your lead pastor. You're there to be having a strong relationship with them and be there and support them in any way possible. And you don't want to be that person who just is apologizing for everything because you're a pleaser. But at the same point, you want to be able to look exactly into your life and into where you're at and say, which part of this do I need to own? Which part of it do I need to clean up in communication? And where can I build up the relational capital so that I can talk with my lead pastor? The main reason why I really wanted to get into this is because that relationship, that symbiotic relationship between temple courts and house to house, is such a delicate one, and it's so special. So often what can happen in ministry is that temple courts and house to house tends to be silos to each other. And part of what can happen is a wedge can be brought through each one of these mistakes to avoid. because, when you have wrong assumptions because, you're not doing good communication, when you can have impatience because you're not trusting, and when you can get defensive because you may not feel you're on eye to eye and you can't do conflict resolution. What can happen is that hurts that hurts the church overall. And what you want to be able to do is use these three indicators, as you're dealing with your lead pastor, to be able to say, okay, how when these things, when they light up on my dashboard, how can I use them to say, okay, now what do I need to do? How do I address each one of these? When there's wrong assumptions, I've got to believe the best in my lead pastor and start to use communication to help you with that. When I'm impatient or small groups aren't clicking quick enough or we're not in sync and stuff like that, be able to have the patience, but also be able to have the good general, bad general in the back of my mind and saying, I want to be the good general as best as possible, but I want to trust God if it's not working as much. And then in the area of defensiveness, I want to be able to say, when that lights up, be able to say, okay, it's a privilege to work here. It may be a little bit messy, but what I want to make sure happens is that I want to make sure that I am leaning into that and being able to say, if I'm defensive, own what I can own, but also try to work on the communication skills that are out there.
Well said. Well, there is your 3 mistakes to avoid with your lead or supervising pastor. And like Steve said, we're going to have the show notes linked below in this episode so that you can click on those and read this if you want, share it. And Steve, any other closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just remember, this is, there's many things. I don't want to over spiritualize this, but like I said before, it's quite the relationship that happens between temple courts and house to house. There's also a balance that, it is a spiritual battle, and wherever the enemy can creep in through any crack that he can get into, he'll do that. But these 3 things I've seen as I've been talking a little bit more in these doldrums of winter, and a lot of times when I guess it's overcast in a lot of part of the country, little things can fester up now and then. And these 3 things that we've had great conversations about, and that's why we wanted to bring them to you and just say, if any of these 3 are creeping up, make sure you address them and take the high road with it.
That's right. Take the high road. And we hope that this episode has encouraged everybody watching or listening. We hope that this empowers you to lead healthier, better small group ministry where you're at. And we hope this one specifically helps you to have a better relationship with your lead or supervising pastor. So until next time, we will see you later.
See you there.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And to dive in deeper, get more resources, or join the Small Group Network, just head over to smallgroupnetwork.com.